it wasn't just that one event, it was a lot of things that led up to that one event. And so I just wanted to set the framework. So just give me a couple more headlines from that era.
Quite a few that were in the paper, and mostly violent, a lot of bad news. I'm sorry? Okay. There was quite a few articles that continued in that time frame, and as you can kind of see here, I'll hold it up a little bit after I'm done speaking. Most of them had to do with people getting shot, people getting robbed, a lot of violence, and there's a lot of things going on that needed to be addressed. So there was quite a few articles that followed, and I'll hand the microphone back to the chief, and I'll kind of flip through a few of them to show you. But there was quite a few of them in that era.
So as he's flipping through now, a lot of these articles are etched into my mind. I really don't need the book. I'll tell you what they're going to say, because I had to build a PowerPoint presentation to explain to people at the Attorney General's conference what was going on in Racine. Racine was #1 per capita in Part 1 crime. So those are your major crimes: homicides, burglaries, sexual assaults, so all your major Part 1 crimes, we were #1 in the state. So that means Milwaukee, Madison, Green Bay, we were the worst of the worst. So when Dick Polzin took over, he had quite a challenge. He also had the challenge, as Mike flips through this, there was some concerns relative to the racial makeup of the organization. And Dick Polzin called me into his office. I'm a young sergeant. And he says to me, he says, you know, what we have to do with this organization is somehow the organization has to look more like the community that we police. Now it's kind of like the Bible. I didn't write that story. That's actually what it was there. And so what Chief Polzin did is he commissioned a recruitment team, and we put together a recruitment team, and so we were able to do some really unique things in terms of attracting a broader spectrum of people from the community who, and that's not to say that I don't want my comments to be misunderstood. You don't have to be a person of color to be an effective officer. But you should have a community that's reflective of you should have a department that's reflective of the community. And that's just because if there's ownership, and then if you take color completely out of it, it's often great to have people who police the community who live in the general area, because oftentimes there's greater ownership. And so 1993, we're starting to do some really unique things in terms of demographics on the department, in terms of community outreach. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly what community policing is, because a lot of people use the term and they really don't know what's underneath the term. So going back many years, hundreds of years, to Robert Peel, this is a concept that's an old English concept. The people are the police are the people. So really all that's saying is that we have to work in partnership with the community. So that's not a new concept. It's actually a very old concept. But unfortunately, in a lot of challenged areas, central cities, oftentimes, unfortunately, the police could be perceived as an occupying force, where they're just there. And sometimes people perceived, we had some major problems in LA a few years back, and you had some major problems in Chicago. And sometimes the community almost feels as though the police department can be a third gang that they have to deal with. You know, you have the vice lords and the disciples and the police. Now that's unfortunate that mindset existed, but the reality is, we have to be honest, that it existed. And so these are the challenges that Chief Polzin was up against when he was appointed. So what did we do? We knew that driving by in a neighborhood, with your car windows rolled up, with the air conditioning on, no one really knew the police officers, and unless you grew up here. And so I had a slight advantage that way. But for people who were not a part of this community, they were foreigners in a sense. And so what we did with the community policing philosophy, when we put the substations in place, Mike Polzin was one of the first, and Marty DeFati. These officers literally set up camp in the neighborhoods, because we had a lot of great neighbors in these areas who were just afraid to talk to the police, because it's like, hey, listen, my house gets shot up, you're going to be here for 5 minutes, you're going to leave, and I have to live here for the other 364 days of the year. And so when we moved in and established more of a long-term relationship with the folks in the neighborhood, it did a couple things. The first thing it did is it let the residents know that it let them know who we were. So the officers developed some personal relationships. But the more important thing that it did is it let them know that we were actually concerned about the neighborhoods. And to the tune of almost $1 million worth of real estate has been purchased in these areas so that we can do some policing. And so what I'm going to do at this moment, did Sergeant Batoyer make her way in? Okay, she's behind me, okay. Sergeant Batoyer, and we'll get to Sergeant Smith shortly, but Sergeant Jessie Batoyer, many of you know her, she's our public information officer now. I had her job in 1995, and before I bring her on, I'm just going to tell you what that looked like for me. 94 and 95 were the worst years ever in the history of the city in terms of murder. We had about 30 young people who lost their lives all within that 24-month span. And I know this personally because I would get these phone calls at 2, 3 in the morning, and you'd have to come to work, and you'd have to explain to the media what happened. And no disrespect to the current company, but I could count on the media to be there on those occasions. But when we were taking kids fishing and all that kind of stuff, I never really saw them. But that's editorial. I want to bring Jessie up because she did some work with the Community Policing Initiative in early 2000, and so I kind of talked about what the landscape looked like in the early 90s. We'll talk a little bit about her era. We'll move on to Sergeant Smith's era, and then we'll talk a little bit about the future in the context of where we are nationally with law enforcement. So, Sergeant Matoyer. Just,
Sure. Hi, good evening. So in the early 2000s, I was a fresh patrol officer, really excited about community policing here, and I was assigned first to a beat position, and I was all over town. And then I got what to this day is my, yes ma'am? Louder, sorry. I always think I sound loud, but I guess I don't. In the early 2000s, I started out as a beat patrol officer, and then I got what was my favorite assignment to this day, which was as a neighborhood COP officer in the Geneva Street COP house. The crime there was not nearly what it was in the early 90s, but it was still, we had lots of open air drug dealing, lots of shootings, several homicides, but there was a different feel. I had a great community who came to my house and would come to meetings and talk to me about what was going on. We had kids from the neighborhood coming in, cleaning the house or just doing little odd jobs here and there, homework. And then we were having quite a little increase in shootings and homicides, and then the gang diversion, or the federal gang crime task force was developed, and we ended up working closely with them. And a lot of that they had a high amount of success with ending some of the gang violence and federal conspiracy cases. But what I found when I was in that neighborhood was I felt like it was my own. And our neighborhoods are filled with just wonderful people. Wonderful people. Sorry, really close. Oh, there we go. All right. What I found was that our neighborhoods are just filled with wonderful people, and there's a small portion of people who are committing crimes and making life miserable for the really great people who live in all of our neighborhoods. Let's see. Anything?
just I'll call on you really quickly.
Okay.
So for those of you who couldn't hear Sergeant Matoyer, she was actually a neighborhood officer. She spent some time in the neighborhoods, and she's a little modest and she's a little shy sometimes, but I can tell you this about her. She was one of the most tenacious people out there, and what I really admired about her work is that people trusted her. If we had an event that would happen, you know, people would call her and they would talk to her and they would tell her what happened because they trusted her. And as we look at the national landscape, that's really my prayer, that we could figure out a way to restore trust. And I think the way you do that is through, you have to be your organization has to be transparent. That's one of the reasons I'm here tonight. As a police officer in general, you work, I mean, since the day I was hired, you know, you have to work the 4th of July. And when I say you have to work the 4th of July, I mean you have to work the 4th of July. From the time the parade starts, well, you work your shift first, and then you go to the parade, and then you might get to go home for a minute, and then you come back for the fireworks. So there's just demands on your time as an officer. And so, but what I've learned through that is that the community really supports what we do. And so I would pray that other departments can take a page from the book that has been written, starting with the Polzine organization on through the current one, and we can move forward. I'm going to switch over to Sergeant Smith in just a minute. I just want to set this up, and then we'll talk about the future, or the present and the future. Sergeant Smith is in charge of the COP unit now, so that is comprised of all of the neighborhood houses and what we call the beat patrol officers. So what are beat patrol officers, and why do we have them? Well, beat patrol officers that's the essence of community policing. So the houses are nice, but you really need, sometimes the crime or the problems are at a place that's not close to a COP house. So the beat officers can go wherever there are problems. And so through a series of federal grants and through a series of reorganizations out of the department, we've been able to reorganize so that we can have officers that we can just dedicate for strictly problem solving. That's what COP is really all about. You go into an area and you figure out what's going on, and then you solve that problem. I'm going to turn it over to Sergeant Smith really shortly, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about the current landscape and moving forward.
You know, I could probably sit here for a day and talk about what community policing is and what that actually is at the police department. I'm probably going to echo a few things the chief said and a few things that Sergeant Matoyer said as well. As the chief said, I currently supervise the community policing unit. And I guess a couple things that I want you guys to take away from tonight when we talk about community policing and what that is in Racine. And again, a little bit of an echo of some of the things the chief said. Some of you may have heard the term weed and seed, and I mean, community policing is a philosophy, and obviously that can be different things in different communities, and we're fortunate in this department that it's a department-wide philosophy, but we take it a little bit extra step, and we actually have a dedicated unit to carry out that philosophy. And the manner in which we carry that philosophy out for us current day, much in what they did years past, but we looked at things that worked and things that we want to continue on, and that's what we build upon today. And really what we keep seeing, even though COP has been around for 20 some years just for this department alone, that we didn't see philosophy as the thing that kind of holds true. And in essence, it's a very simple approach. Again, it's how that's carried out. You have the weeding. You want to go into a neighborhood, go into an area, and you want to remove that problem. And that's difficult, and you have a lot of issues that you have to work with the trust in that area, and then once that problem has been removed, you want to come in and see that area as well. And again, trust is very much important in that stage as well. So those are kind of the two areas I'm just going to kind of hit on for us now in our approach and what we do. When we go into a neighborhood, an area, and we look at weeding or we look at a problem, I challenge our officers to make sure they're surgical in their approach. So what we don't want to do, and what we know doesn't work, because this has failed in many other places in the past, you can't just go into a neighborhood, go into an area, and just throw a blanket into a neighborhood. If we are experiencing a large problem with whether it be drugs or whether it be gang graffiti, whatever the problem is, if we go into that neighborhood and assume that everybody is taking part in that activity, we're not going to be effective, and we're not going to gain any trust. So that's where it becomes a challenge for us as a department, and my officers especially, to make sure that we're deliberate in what we're doing, and that we make sure that we're not just targeting a specific neighborhood or a specific gender or a specific group of people or a specific, you could put any other term underneath that, and we want to make sure that we're deliberate in what we're doing. So when we look at a neighborhood, how we make sure that we are not just throwing a blanket over the neighborhood is obviously with our own intelligence. You know, this day and age, computers and all the things that are out there, there's a lot of stuff out there technology-wise. We try to use that to our advantage to actually track crime and track different trends and use that to our advantage so that we can kind of predict where things might be going that way. What we also do is listen to the community. Because even though many say the police are the first line people in the community, that's not really true. The people that live in that neighborhood are the first line people in that neighborhood. They're the ones that know what's going on. So those are the ones that we really need to make sure that we connect with, because again, they're the ones that are going to hopefully tell us what's going on. And sometimes the problems that we assume are problems aren't always the actual problem. And sometimes they're just minor quality of life issues. So again, when we go in, we want to be surgical, and if the problem is, maybe it's just some graffiti, maybe it's just littering, maybe it's loitering. It could be all kinds of things. But once things do go wrong and then they spin out of control, that's where we need to make sure we're coming in early on and trying to address some of the problems of the neighborhood. On the second end of it was with the seating, as I spoke of. Again, community policing isn't effective if you don't have both. If you go 100% either way, you're not really going to be as effective as you could be. So for us seating, it's important to take a look at what's needed in that particular neighborhood or that particular area. Why do some of the problems exist? Is there some kind of programming? Is there some kind of connection we can make with that neighborhood to help that neighborhood sustain without all the problems? So I'll give you an example. In our 16th Street neighborhood, we've done a whole lot of work in that neighborhood. There's been a lot of crime activity in the neighborhood, and we've done a lot with intelligence to figure out who exactly the problems are and deliberately go after the people that are actually causing the problem, not that neighborhood. So one thing we found is that there's a lot of young people in that neighborhood, and we started to look at some of the gang activity and why are they doing this? Why are these kids involved in this? Why are these 11, 12-year-old kids involved in gang activity? And what we really came to find is that just because there's not much else in that neighborhood for them to do. So the Officer Peterson is the neighborhood officer that's assigned to 16th Street. And here again, we partnered with Safe Haven, and Officer Peterson and Safe Haven do a guys' night. It's on Tuesday nights in the house, and the kids can come in, and they have a little bit of a life skills session that starts the day. And then after that, it's kind of, they can talk about what's going on at home, they can talk about what's going on at school, talk about what's going on in the neighborhood. So what we find is that even on some nights that's not going on, the kids come and the kids talk, and it's a positive place for them to be. So it kind of also shows the police in a different light as well, and probably flips the script for some of these kids maybe of how they've seen the police in the future, or in the past, I'm sorry. Obviously, law enforcement's what we do. I mean, that's what we're here to do. But we've found through the years that there's more effective ways to do law enforcement if you think outside the box and be a little creative. So that's kind of what we've been doing, and really the things I've talked about are what we want to expand upon, and just kind of fine tune those a little bit more. Use some of the more technology to predict a little bit where we put our efforts and so forth, and just try to stay in tune with what's happening in the neighborhoods before things get too out of control. And again, as the chief said, from a problem-solving standpoint, to go in and try to see if we can look at some of those issues before they become issues, bigger issues, I should say. So that, in a nutshell, is community policing. And again, like I said, we could talk for 3 days on all that, and we could expand upon it more. But that's in a nutshell. So thank you.
Awesome. I'm just going to really quickly amplify a couple things that Sergeant Smith said, and then I'm going to read something out of this book, and then we're going to talk national events, and then we're going to give, I'm not exactly sure how the forum works, but certainly we want to not pontificate. We want to hear what others have to share, because that's a part of community policing. You receive information as much as you deliver it. So one thing I want to amplify really quickly is Sergeant Smith used the term surgical. I love to use this term when I talk to, way before Ferguson. When I talk to young officers, I tell them, the Central City is a unique area, right? You have a lot of stuff going on, just like in any other area. You have to, when we use the term surgical, what that means is you kind of have to know what you're looking for, right? You can't just go through the neighborhood and with a big fishnet and scoop everybody up and throw the good ones back, because you offend people when you do that. So as a prop, I'm going to call this young man up who I see in the back. Corbin, why don't you come up for a minute? I've seen this kid around before. So this kid grew up in Mount Pleasant, but this is my son, Corbin. Corbin was a little one. He was premature when he was born. I think he caught up. He's about 2 pounds and 9 ounces. Okay, so Corbin, you see, he's got these braids, and it's not really how I would wear my hair, but he was born about 50 years later than I was, so close to, not quite that much. But at any rate, the point is, he looks, if you don't know him, he looks kind of menacing somewhere. He looks nice tonight, but he doesn't always look like this. You put the wrong clothes on him. Like his sister, who's in the back, she went to University of St. Louis, SLU. She also has a master's from Wisconsin. They have sweatshirts that say that stuff. Sometimes they're hooded sweatshirts. If he's in the wrong gear, in the wrong area, somebody might draw the wrong conclusion.
Right.
This kid had a 4.0 grade average at one point in his career. I think he falls off every now and then. but you get the point. So I want to amplify the term surgical. What that means is we're not looking for everybody. We're looking for the problem. Everybody isn't the problem. And so I just wanted to magnify that point because that's large. You can have things, Corbin. Another term that he threw out at you really fast, he had a lot of information in his head and he could go on for hours. He talked about weeding and seeding. Now some people know what the weed and seed initiatives are all about. You know, you go through an area and if you take out the bad stuff, if you don't plant good stuff, then the bad stuff will grow again. So when you talk about weed and seed initiatives, what you're talking about is doing the surgical stuff that Sergeant Smith is talking about, but then you have to do some initiatives to make sure that the decent stuff overwhelms the negative stuff. We do homework assistance out of the COP houses. We do a nutrition program out of the COP houses. We do any number of things. They're almost like little mini social service agencies, but the police officers themselves aren't in there doing those things. Other people are. We facilitate that, and it's appropriate to mention Thelma Orr. One of our houses is named after Thelma Orr. Obviously, a giant, kind of like a Central City Mother Teresa in our era, and so the things that we do out of those houses build the community. So it's bigger than the police department. It's much bigger than we have a role, but the community has a role as well. I'm just going to, because I really want to get to some comments that might be waiting, but I want to just share a little bit, and I invite you all to come up afterwards and kind of thumb through these books because they're just fascinating, the information that's in here, and then I'm going to share some good news, and then we're going to talk about our community versus the national landscape. 1993, March 22nd, our congratulations to the new chief, which was Polzine at the time. Won't read the whole article, but a couple excerpts. Polzine comes to the department that has many pluses, including a strong and well-trained force and a city that for the most part supports their efforts. But it is not a department without challenges. A primary challenge is the need for the police department to attain higher visibility in the community and to strengthen the community sense that police are together in the effort to make our community safer. Experiences of the past couple of years have demonstrated that Racine has many of the same types of crime problems that plague larger cities. Now, obviously located between Milwaukee and Chicago, we get a lot of the overflow from things that happen there. We believe Polzine has the talent and the personnel to accomplish these goals, and that the community at large is ready to work with him in achieving these goals. Now, that was actually proven to be the case. When Dick Polzine left office, and he and I joked about it, as I was sharing earlier, being a police officer is tough. Being a police chief is tougher because my day starts at about 5 in the morning, and it ends maybe about 11 at night. And this is like almost every day, and if something happens, then I'll get called in at 2, 3 in the morning. So, but towards the end of his career, I can remember him saying, he did all that he could do, and he felt it was time to step aside. And so at the time that he did step aside, Racine had a 30-year low in Part 1 crime. Now remember, we went from being number 1 in Part 1 crime, which was not a good thing, to a 30-year low. Today, and I'm going to make this available to anybody who wants a copy of it via the internet, but we just published our annual report for last year, and so we took Dick Polzine's 30-year low and we amplified it to a 49-year low. And the only reason it's a 49-year low is because there's only records for 49 years. It's probably lower than that, but they only have records that go back to 1965. And so we are extremely happy with what we've been able to accomplish, but at the same time, we're not ready to throw this big ticker tape parade and pat ourselves on the back and congratulate each other, because our work is never done. We realize that, as long as there's unemployment, as long as there's substance abuse, as long as there's sexual abuse, as long as there's any number of ills that the society has, we're going to have challenges. The question is, how do we face those challenges? And are we effective in doing so? So with that as a backdrop, great news for the city of Racine in terms of what we've been able to accomplish, but we can't rest on what has happened over the last few years. We have to decide what we want our department and our community to look like moving forward. Now, I'm just going to take a wild guess and make the assumption that some of you guys are kind of concerned about the events in St. Louis. Would I be accurate?
You're accurate.
I would be accurate. The reason that I shared with you what we went through in '93, where Chief Polzine said he wanted to make sure that the department looked like the community that we police. Clearly, the city of Racine, by virtue of the fact that I stand before you as the first chief of color, I mean, obviously, our community has taken a major step. And so, but it's not all about having a chief of color or a chief with a different gender. It's about having a chief that's competent and that can get the job done. Now, certainly we wouldn't want anybody to be held back for their gender or their color. And so, I'm honored that I had the opportunity to continue Chief Polzine's vision, and I look forward to building on the success that we've had. But it's going to take the business community, it's going to take the elected officials, it's going to take each and every one of you to lift us to the next level. So with that in mind, is it okay that I open this up for dialogue? So I'm sure we have a lot of people who want to speak, but I'm going to ask one of my favorite people to just share a little bit. Sister Lois Aceto has done some sensitivity training for us and some conflict resolution training. I don't know how many years. I was a young rookie when she first started. I think she was 12 when she.
Yeah, right.
But we asked her to come back recently. Now this is pre-Ferguson. This is pre-Ferguson. So I make that point from the perspective that it's always good if you try to find problems before they manifest themselves, right? Like, nobody really wants to tackle cancer at stage 4. If you can find it early, the chances are better. And so that's what our department has been all about, try to find problems and solve problems before they become bigger problems. Now, I would not say that our police organization or any police organization is perfect, because if you have people have issues, right? So, but with that, I just want to bring Sister Lois up and just see if she has anything to ask or share, just to start the dialogue off, and then we'll go around.
Thank you. And I wasn't 12 either. I'm going to be 83 right now. So there. All right. I have been working with conflict resolution, especially in the prison. And before I was here, I worked with WCS, which is in Milwaukee, the Racine Correctional Service, and I was the liaison for all the prisons in the state, and so I know them all. And I think one of the things that bothers me the most is the number of inmates that we have that are of color. And I still worry about that now. In fact, I teach right now at RIAC, the prison on North Memorial, and there are we have 450 inmates there, from the ages of 16 to 24, so they're young guys, And they bring this up to me, mind you. How come? Look at this class, And I said, I know it. And I said, you tell me. Well, then everything gets silent, But I think one of the things that bothers me the most is, because I also help out juvenile detention, And that's where I come back crying every day. And I mean that seriously. Seriously. Well, our children, need a mother and a father, and this is what's missing in a lot of families, unfortunately. And, and I don't know if any of you have ever read the book Lost Boys. It's by Garbarino. He's a psychologist. And there's a sentence in that book that says every single person needs one person in their life who's crazy about them. We all need one person who's crazy about us because we cannot survive otherwise. And I think that this is what we need to do with our young people. And in my conflict class, I have a little paper that says, "You're special." And when I read, nobody laughs like you, nobody smiles like you, nobody talks like you, and it goes on, and they just listen to me. You can hear a pin drop in the classroom. And when I'm finished, all of a sudden they clap. That's a shock for me. But I'm still very concerned of why our prison population is more people of color. And I'm talking Latinos too. And so that's one of my preoccupations. But the conflict resolution classes helps, I think, a hope. Okay.
Thank you. So now I want to kind of open this dialogue up a little bit so that we can interact and get some feedback. So, Mr. Gardner in the back.
You just said something that struck me. We in Wisconsin lead the nation in trying to bring people of color. Is there anything that we as a people think we can do to look at that? Why is that happening?
Right.
Is it because we get stopped more? We get looked at more? There you go.
The laws change.
What is it? I mean, what could we do? Yeah.
Now that for those who couldn't hear Mr. Gardner, he's amplifying what Sister Lois said, and what he's asking is essentially, he's asking, is there some systemic reasons that you have the disproportionate numbers? And so, interesting question. I can tell you a couple things. We just had a visit. For those of you who are in the room who may know Lindsay Draper, he worked at the state, and he was in charge of an initiative that dealt with disproportionate minority confinement. So that he has been replaced, and now there's another person from the state who was just at the police department last week. And so when you ask, Mr. Gardner, when you ask what can be done, there's already some things being done in terms of the reason that they were at the police department is to look at our records in terms of anytime we had a juvenile in the building. Now this wasn't just about color, it was any juvenile. So they want to, even if we brought a kid there for curfew, they want to know how long the kid was in the building and if they were released to their parent. So actually, to be completely open with you, part of the reason that people weren't able to quantify this is because they didn't have the data needed to quantify it. But now we're being mandated to report, even though we don't have a lockup facility, we don't have a jail at the police department, but we can detain people in interview rooms. And so what we were told is that even if you detain someone, that has to be reported to the state. And so now we're actually opening the doors up for getting more data that can, that hopefully can help us decide, how is this happening, and why is it happening, and how can you deal with it. But that's a good question, and quite frankly, we do have some people that are looking at putting more data together. Yes, ma'am.
Not a question, but an answer to Sister Lois's question. She says, why are there so many more people of color in our jails? I happened to be at a meeting at the police department with some of the officers, and there was a lady there trying to get her U visa. She asked the officers, the person who shot my son is going to be scarred for the rest of his life. He can't get a job because his face is so ugly. He, in essence, has been sentenced to a life in prison. But the person who was responsible for shooting him only got 18 months in jail. The answer that the officer gave me was, well, he probably had the resources so he could get out of jail sooner. If you have the money, you're not going to do the time. If you don't have the money, you're set for life.
Well, those are some profound comments, and everybody couldn't hear what you said, and everybody doesn't know what a U visa is. And so what she shared is that she was sharing a young man was shot, and when you are a victim of a crime, you can apply for temporary status as a result of your level of cooperation with authorities. And so that was all done under the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. So if I'm a person that's not documented and somebody breaks into my house and I have to cooperate with the police, the reason that Homeland Security initiated the Youth Visa program is so that people who were not documented would not be afraid to come forward. I mean, if we're going to be a police department that works on data to know where we should deploy our resources, sometimes you don't get the data because people are afraid to come forward because they're not documented. So that's what she's referring to. But on the backside of that, when you go for a U visa, you have to be, your record has to be pretty clean, and it has to be clear that you don't present a threat on the other side from a crime perspective. And so it's a broader issue, but thank you for your comments. Yes, ma'am.
Was 2013, 12-13, I had a full-blown stroke, and the police officers, the woman, two women took me to my bedroom, and because I needed to look better, and I could have died because this was very bad. When I went to the hospital, this officer, this woman, I can't think of her name right now, she was with me from 3 o'clock to 8 o'clock. She stayed with me. So I think this is really excellent.
I appreciate the comments. We're always happy to hear. From time to time, as chief, I get phone calls from people, and it's rare. So I really cherish when people take the time to say thank you. We respond to about 70,000 calls a year, and I'll let you in on another secret. We don't get calls where people say, hey, my kids are getting great grades and we just bought a new car, we're going to get a new house next week. We just invited you over to have lunch with us because things are going great and we wanted to celebrate. We don't get those calls. They're generally negative in nature. And so, but even in crisis, right, I think the value of an organization is where you can see the spirit of the people who respond to these calls. We had a young officer, he responded to a call. Young boy had his bike stolen, and the young boy was autistic. So the officer just searched the neighborhood, and he could not find this bike. So basically he went out and bought a bike, and then he took the bike to the kid the next day. And just unbelievable.
He never told a soul.
He didn't tell anybody. He didn't even want me to know about it. But you can't keep everything from the chief. Somebody's gonna tell me. And so what we didn't make a big stink about it in roll call because we knew the guys would give him a hard time. But we did. It is noteworthy. It is noted in his file because that's the measure of the organization, the people that you select. You know, you have to measure their heart, not so much their color. Yes, sir.
I had a question, and I'm not sure if it's a question or a statement, but you can tell me if I'm going in the right direction.
Okay.
But in terms of criminality, and I know crime is a crime, and you know you're here to protect and serve. But is it not the district attorney that weighs harder on you to decide what to bring charges on? Because there are some things that you may pull somebody over and you may say, oh, go, but they're setting the mandate on what they want to prosecute. So in terms of mass incarceration, what I found in gatherings like this from city to city is that the mandate comes down, and it seems to be more probable that people of color, whether they're black or brown, are being taken or being charged because that's what is being charged, or the higher powers want to be charged. Now I'm asking, is that correct, or do you see that as a problem, or?
Okay, so what I'll do is, so you preface it by saying you didn't know if it was a question or a statement. It was more of an oratory presentation. That's what it really was. And so, however, I'm going to address it. And it was eloquent. I'm going to shock you. A couple different layers. Because I heard everything you said, multiple layers. You would be shocked to find out that, police officers and district attorneys are usually on the opposite side of the spectrum in terms of what should happen in cases. And I'll tell you why. Police officers, because we have to deal with a lot of issues, if we arrest someone and we think we have probable cause to arrest that person, we want the district attorney to prosecute the person. Oftentimes, the district attorney, they look at it from a perspective of, can we get a conviction? And if they don't believe they can get a conviction, they'll send it back. And that frustrates officers because they feel like we wasted a lot of time and you sent this back. But I'm not gonna avoid the other layer that's in there when you were talking about who sets the agenda. What you're essentially talking about is sentencing structures, things where there's a different sentence for powder cocaine versus crack cocaine and all that. That's systemic, right? That's where the layers were. But just on a day-to-day level, the district attorneys and the police officers often are at odds because the police officer operates on probable cause. Is there probable cause to make this arrest? Is there prima facie evidence that XYZ occurred? We can meet that standard. It's harder to meet the burden of proof standard beyond a reasonable doubt. So a lot of things don't actually go to trial. And I will also shock you to tell you, now this is where Sister Lois and I are on the same page for 90% of what we have to deal with. She's very passionate about young people being in jail. She doesn't like that. And as a community, we should try to figure out ways to deal with that. But then there are some young people who commit felonies and break into houses that should be in jail. And so, one time she saw me out at Wingspread and she was talking about a particular judge who was locking up juveniles for burglary. And I'm like, well, yeah, because I told him to do that. It's hard to admit that to her. But I think all jokes aside, what we have to figure out is who presents the greatest threat to us, right? So, and then is there a way we can work with the people who don't present a threat to us? Is there a way we can intervene? Because I was really afraid that one of these kids was going to go into the wrong house and get killed. That's what I was really afraid of, and I would rather have the kid locked up than dead. And so now we're looking at other ways to deal with kids who have repeat offenses for burglary. We're looking at some more electronic monitoring so that they can not be incarcerated, but we can know where they are. They've demonstrated that we need to know where they are because you don't want them in your house, right?
Right.
So, but yeah, multifaceted question. And I hope I didn't pontificate more than you did with my answer. Yes, Ms. Howard. Yes, ma'am.
I actually have two questions. First, not all police officers are bad. I've actually, as first vice president of the NAACP, have worked with some great officers. Last year we worked with officers in our gun buyback program to get unwanted guns off the streets. I think that it's just the certain officers that are not necessarily morally correct that causes a bad name for the entire organization. So I want to say that. But my first question is, how is the process with making the Racine Police's organization mimic our community? That is something that you said that the police organization is working on. I'd like to know, where is that at? What's the percentage of officers that are of color compared to our community? Because I think our community has a lack of trust in some areas. And then when I don't see someone who necessarily reflects me, it can cause even more lack of trust. So where is that process at? And then the second question is, I think that we're here today because of Ferguson, because not necessarily that the police aren't doing their job, but the discipline of police officers seems to be different than the discipline that we receive as regular citizens. What we have to go through and what we have to be held accountable for when we do something wrong seems to be at total odds when police officers do something wrong and the accountability that is held for them. So those are my 2 questions.
Okay, actually, there's a lot in there, so we're gonna. It wasn't as bad as Pastor, but you got your money's worth out of that one question too. So you know, and I'm gonna pick on you a little bit, just so that we can, as a family, we can embrace some of our fears and our perspectives. And so you start out by saying, not all police officers are bad. Well, that's an icebreaker right there. Like, we don't hate all of you, just most of you. And I know you didn't. I know what you meant. I really do. And you're right. You know, you can go to any profession and you're going to find people who excel, and you're going to find people who just do enough to get by, and then you'll find below average people. And so it would probably come as no shock to you. And I can talk locally, and then, because I know your last comment was broader, it was national. You know, unfortunately, now we don't advertise this, but there have been people who had to be terminated from this job over the years, because not everybody is cut out to do this job. You know, you have to make split-second decisions. You have to have the discernment, you know, to be balanced and fair when you do that. So there's you could have an IQ higher than anyone else, but you might not be the right person to be a police officer. You know, and Dick Polzine was, to answer your specific question about where are we and what happened after the 90s. We brought a lot more female officers on, a lot more officers of color on in that era. Are we at the exact percentage of the city? No. There's work to be done, but when this conversation comes up, and I never run from it, you know, certainly you want to have the department, any department, mirror the community, but that's not your first option. That's not your first concern. Your first concern is that you get competent people. And then amongst those competent people, you want to have balance, right? So you want to secure those 2 things. And so then your last statement was pretty broad relative to essentially what you're saying is that the rules seem to be different. You know, and the people who are held to a higher standard are sometimes not held to a higher standard. You know, did I understand the statement? Yeah, and so, again, I think the nation, you know, and the unique thing about Ferguson, and I didn't want the good news from Racine, the 49-year crime low and some of the positive things that are happening, I didn't want all of that to be overshadowed by something that's happening in another state. However, whenever something like that happens, it gives you the opportunity to do some self-assessment, right? To find out, okay, we may not have that toxic of a climate, but we got to check ourselves to make sure that, you know, that we never do. And so what I don't want to do is play the district attorney and be the adjudicator from 500 miles away. You know, but what I can do is look at what is happening in other places of the country, and I can try to formulate a strategy to make sure that, you know, I can have an impact on those types of things locally. So I hope I addressed most of your concerns. Yes, sir. Pastor Naye.
First of all, I want to commend you.
Thank you, sir.
Primarily for sharing with us the 49-year low, which means that you're more proactive than reactive.
Yes, sir.
We're not Ferguson, and just by having this session indicates that we have no intentions of being a Ferguson. One of the things I would like for us to keep in mind is that when you called your son up, one word came to mind, and that was perception. We have 3 subcultures in Racine. Euro-American, Afro-American, Latino-American. Now we have other subcommunities, but these are the three basic subcultures we have in Racine.
Pastor, can you come up? Because I get the impression, yeah.
Can I hear me?
Yeah. No, listen. They're taping this, and when people say profound things, they should be captured so that we can share them later. So I have to bring you up here, Pastor. Thank you.
I was ending by saying, are all three perceptions the same? Are they? No. Then we have work to do.
All right, thank you, Pastor. Thank you. Pastor Nye is a brilliant man, and he, myself, Mr. Gardner, and others, pre-Ferguson, we sit down. I see Alderman Deal is in the back. I see Alderman Perez. We sit down and we have community conversations, and so this is great. But I just want you all to know that this isn't the first time that we have an opportunity to problem solve. And so we've been, Mr. Gardner and I and some others, Donnie Snow, Morris Reese, we worked on putting a Racine Civil Leaders Academy school together, where we're doing some interactive learning for young kids of color at the neighborhood level. And so I'm not making the assertion that we've somehow cured everything, because there's a lot of work to do. But what I am stating is that before this national issue blew up, you had a lot of people in this community who had their boots on the ground doing a lot of good work, and so that should be acknowledged. Mr. Gardner, one more time.
I'm hoping you can convince the district attorney to come out and do something like this. Put it in his head that he need to get out of here, so we can talk to him too. Because this is good. I like to face people who up there so I can say what I need to say to him. He's in that office. He never gets out around us.
Well, I'm going to make sure that he gets the message that he needs to come out. Yes, sir.
All right, Chief, you mentioned the sister, and it seemed like you're going towards the direction of cultural responsiveness, cultural sensitivity, cultural awareness. Have your department addressed any of those kinds of issues along the lines of development or training, and to what extent? Because on one hand you have the crime, but then there's the sense of the culture of the department and their awareness. So you think that has there been training on those lines? Do you feel a need for that in your department or not?
Well, definitely. When we brought Sister over the years, and we've done some not only conflict resolution training, but we've done some cultural training as well. It doesn't happen every year because we have certain mandatory training that we have to have for evasive driving, firearms, and things of that nature. But we have done that. And when Sister Lois, the reason I brought her up at the outset is she has a tough topic to talk about because as you noticed, she's kind of passionate, right? So she's confronted police officers about what she perceived to be police demeanor that she felt was potentially adversarial. That doesn't always go over well, but as the chief, it's my responsibility to put information before the officers so that we can change minds and hearts where necessary. And so I'm not always, some of the topics are not always popular, but I can assure you that that we push the envelope relative to training so that our people will get what they need. In the back? Yes, ma'am.
Could you explain what NOBLE is and how does it affect our Racine?
NOBLE as in the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives? That NOBLE, or did I understand the question wrong? Yeah, so I don't profess to know the origin of the organization, but NOBLE is an organization of law enforcement executives of color. Now you might wonder, well, there's the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Why do you have to have a separate one? Why does everything have to be separate? That's divisive. Well, that's certainly one perspective, but because there are so few people in that category, just like there's a women's a female leadership group. And so sometimes when you have a smaller group of people who not only have the challenges of regular leadership, they have the challenge of being a person that's not a traditional person in leadership. So that's why you have those type of organizations. And so it's fraternal in the sense that it's designed to not only build your strengths as a leader, but to help you transition into an area where there's not a lot of people who look like you. Did I capture your essence of your question? In the back?
And then she's still asking. She's still looking for clarification.
Basically, you're kind of echoing what was said before about there still needs to be work, even within the police department, to acceptance of someone who is different, whether it's culturally or racially or whatever. And because the separation of groups without respect for for each other and their culture and their background and whatever is still a big issue. And that calls to mind kind of also what one of the Milwaukee police officers was speaking about tonight with regards to criminal profiling and racial profiling. And they had said that racial profiling is not done by them, but they do act on criminal profiling. And does that line ever cross over to the other one, where so often that more men of color or people of color then end up on the criminal profile side and being arrested than not?
So once again, I mean, a lot is in your comments. So I'm going to throw out a scenario here. Steve Hurley and we started the Racine Police Athletic Association in '95 in order to develop better relationships with young people, and so that organization has grown. But Steve went on to be the chief out in the town of Geneva. So he and we talk frequently. We were just at an FBI conference last week, and so we talk quite often, and so quite frequently. And so Steve, we were talking about a speed wave that they had out there. That's money that we get from the state, where you have areas where there's high accident rate. You can go out and you can basically cause people to slow down by writing a bunch of tickets. So you might, out in that area where Steve is in the town of Geneva, the overwhelming number of people that they stop are not people of color, because there's not a lot of people of color in that area. And so when we look at bias policing, when we look at profiling, when we look at all the things that have been a problem in law enforcement, I shared the information that I just shared with you so that you can also bake into the cake the fact that if you're policing a community that's 90% of anything, the law of averages will tell you that that's going to be the people that you're going to interact with. That's a fact, but that's not running away from your statement. I'm just giving you some extra information to consider so that if you want to get to the root cause of it, don't calculate the noise, calculate the factual information, which goes back to what Mr. Gardner was stating earlier. When you have more data, then you can draw more accurate conclusions and have a stronger case. Mr. Farr, and then I'm going to go to the back there.
It's three things that crosses my mind. First of all, I came to Racine when I was 16. I'm 63. I've seen the change in the Racine Police Department. If I had to put it on a judgment and look at the three departments, Kenosha, Racine, Mount Pleasant, Sturtevant, I would say Racine has really, their police department has really changed. Honestly, I think we have the best police department out of the three: Kenosha, Racine, Sturtevant, Mount Pleasant. We have the best police department, in my opinion. And the other thing is, I came here when I was 16. We have a problem with the judicial system, the court system. Now I came 16 and I'm 63. I yet have never seen an African-American judge or a Spanish judge on the bench. But yet, we go before these judges. How do we know that we're being treated justly where we don't have the opportunity of our own peers. I think it is the Bar Association moral obligation. If they don't have someone running for that position, then it should be the Bar Association moral obligation to make sure that's in place. You know, a lot of people go through that court system. Is it racist profile? Sure. We do have the same state. We live in the state of Wisconsin. You go to Kenosha and the rules are different, but the laws on the books are the same. So that right there causes a conflict, especially in the child support agency. When it comes down to really child support agency is a really big bad situation where the fathers are not in the homes, and they set up a situation where the child support agency is the collection agency and the judicial system is the enforcement. But the child support agency, to me, is set up like the IRS. They can't be touched. They can't be called to accountability when they're abusing the children. But all children are entitled to a mother and a father. And some don't want to be a father, some don't want to be a mother. But those who do have to suffer. So the court system is just as in raw place as well as the police department. But I have seen a change in the police department. And I watched you when you grew up in the ranks, how you came up in the ranks. You didn't just get there, you earned your spot. You know, I watched you come up. I watched the different police chiefs that came into this thing, and Poseen is really one of the chief of police that established community policing. He should get his hat taken off for that, because he did a good thing, communication with the people. So there's some good things. I just want to acknowledge the good things, because I hear a lot about the bad. Very little do we hear about what good the police department has done. That's not brown nosing, that's just setting the record straight.
All right, once I'm going to come to you, I just want to appreciate your comments, Mr. Fard, and also appreciate the work that you have done. I just know on a personal level that you've worked with young people to help fathers establish their rights, and I know you've actually written to Washington, D.C., because I've actually seen some of the communications, and so you're the type of person that we need in the community, people who not only see problems but take action to contribute to resolving the problems. So you have to congratulate yourself as well for that spirit. Yes, sir. Mr. Black.
If there is a police shooting in Racine, how is that process to the end?
That's a good question. Because of a shooting in Kenosha involving Michael Bell, there's new standards in place for anytime there's a law enforcement agency that's involved in an officer-involved shooting, they can't manage their own investigation. That's state law. So they have to basically farm that out to a different organization because just by virtue of the transparency issue. So that's a good question. Somebody had their hand up. Yes, ma'am. Well, this young man was,
blacks make up like 6% of the population of Wisconsin, but yet we make up the third highest rate in the nation of black incarcerated.
Number one in the nation.
And you're 10 times more likely being a black resident in Wisconsin to be incarcerated than any other. Now, are you saying that's just because of the numbers, or are you saying, is it profiling? What is it? Because you said earlier about the speed traps that the rates of arrest make up just the general population of that area, but the numbers don't bear that out.
Yeah, first of all, whenever your comments are profound, but I'll just give you some advice moving forward. Whenever you use data or numbers, you might want to quote your sources, and because
that's from the Wall Street Journal. It's
okay,
an online article.
Okay, but it's always good to do that.
I can tell you the doctor. I can tell you the study that was taken from.
Right, And right, and you can actually give that to me personally, but hear me out. Yeah, now listen, I'm not going to debate you, because that's not, you don't know me. I'm not going to debate you. If you want to hear me, because I heard you. Okay, so what I said about what was going on in the town of Geneva, what I said in response to the profiling comment, I said, and I didn't run from the gentleman's statement. What I said was, when you look at profiling, bias policing, and things of that nature, you have to consider the percentage of the people, the area that you're policing. That's what and I said you have to bake that factor into the cake. That's what I said. I think you extracted one part of what I said, but you didn't consider the full measure of what I said. And so what you'll find about me is, I'm not going to run from anything. I'm not responsible for everything that happens in Wisconsin. I was given the authority and the honor to deal with the 15.4 square miles that are here. So if you have specific questions relative to that you want me to address, I can do that. If there's cancer somewhere else, I can't cure it. But I respect, and as a young person, let me say this, because my nature is not to be adversarial. So when I run into a young person like yourself, I'm excited that you show up to this kind of stuff, because that's the problem with a lot of our young people. They're out running around doing a bunch of stuff that adds up to nothing.
Amen.
So whenever I see somebody like yourself who has passion and knowledge and who's articulate and who researches things, I embrace that. Because we need more of that. But we're not adversaries. Yeah, I need you to know that. We're not adversaries, and I have a unique opportunity to change the trajectory of what's going on here locally, and I work really hard to do that, and I welcome anybody who wants to work with me to do that. So I appreciate your comments. Yes, Diane.
Just one more thing.
Yeah.
I don't know the specific numbers of Racine County or Racine City. I don't have those stats available to me, but I just thought those numbers were generalizable.
Yeah,
and generalize those
and for people who didn't hear him, I mean, Ms. Harmon's echoed his comments. I mean, Wisconsin has some high incarceration rates, and that's, to go back to the earlier discussion, we had people from the state that came to the police department 2 weeks ago to basically get more data on who we're bringing into that building, because they didn't have enough data. And so Mr. Draper that I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if you were here yet, but yeah, people have been taxed with trying to figure out what is it about the state that makes those numbers so high. And so as I shared with Mr. Gardner earlier, there is work that's being done to look into that. And so it's a fair question, it's an honest question, it's an open question, and all chiefs should be willing to talk about it. Yes, Diana.
Well, I have a very frustrated concern. We've worked a lot together, and it's usually because sometimes I feel like I'm just complaining to you. But the reality is, the laws have been changed to affect this community a lot more than others. In Wisconsin, and I'll come back to Racine, it's not just the African American community. It is also the Hispanic community. And the larger we become, and the more educated we become, the more targeted we're becoming. Well, actually, we became, because our families are broken and destroyed because of these laws that are changing. So it's not just you as the chief, our DA, and whoever is at state level, federal level, that are changing these laws to affect us here. And we need you to be stronger, more courageous than you are right now, because we're losing our families to either the coffin or prison, and that's enough.
So, yeah, I just want to
I need people to understand, because our community in the last year, we would just go back 1 year. I could go 5, but I'm just gonna go back 1 year. Our businesses, first our people, walking down the street, going to a grocery store, trying to get their money from the bank, whatever, have been beaten and robbed. Hispanics or blacks, but when it comes to a Hispanic, undocumented, even if they try to cooperate, they get more intimidated because it's fear that's placed in them. So then as you place fear in a community, to the elderly, to the young, to the old, you become shut-ins. And we've gone through this over and over again with Neighborhood Watch, with the policing stations. More recently, we've had store burglaries, store properties, banks held by gunpoint. They have video of people doing this, and yet they're not caught.
So Diane, I just gonna have to pause right there.
We're getting frustrated.
Yeah, you're getting frustrated. You're also contaminating people with bad information. So we're gonna.
It's not bad information.
I'm not gonna argue with you. I'm not gonna argue with you either. What I'm gonna do, I listened to about 5 minutes, and so the reason that I paused you on the robbery deal is because a few months back, there was a gentleman. High Street Food was robbed a few times, including within the last few days. The gentleman that robbed High Street Foods this summer was the gentleman that escaped from the county jail, so he was arrested. The gentleman that robbed High Street Foods just recently was arrested yesterday. So I'm never above criticism. I just don't like inaccurate information. So
Some people have been caught.
we've arrested more robbery suspects this year than I can remember. So, but I'm going to go back to another. I'm going to go back to another statement. I'm not going to debate you about that because you clearly didn't know what you were talking about. But on the another issue that you said that you want me to be stronger and have more courage on, I'm going to talk about what I think you were talking about, because you were talking about laws and you talked a little bit about laws that are in place, and I would just encourage everybody that's here. Many of you may or may not know about ALEC. That's the American Legislative Exchange Council, conservative think tank. A lot of laws come from there. When you see a person's name on a bill, 99.9% of the time they didn't write it. Their name is on it. And so you don't need to be talking to the police chief about bills or laws. You need to be talking to legislators, and you need to be concerned about who you vote for. The last comment that I will make, because we're personal friends, and we go way back to like the King Center days, and her passion is unmistaken, and that's why we get along, because we're a lot alike. You may not know this, but on the situation that you talked about with families being broken up and people being robbed and not wanting to speak with police, I'm not trying to compare the current administration with any other administration, but if you do some research and you go down and you find out how many U visas, you go to Catholic Charities and you find out how many U visas have been signed under this administration, courage and strength will not be on trial. Next question.
Question. With the people in jail, locked up, have you conducted a profile, or has anybody conducted a profile relative to education and drug addiction? I'm not talking now about abuse. You use the term abuse. I use addiction.
Well, what we do know, I've been working with the, prison or treatment instead of incarceration group. I mean, there's no secret to anybody that when you look into the incarceration rates, and you're going to have people with either mental health, substance abuse issues, and so clearly and education ties right into that. That's why I shared earlier the work that we're doing, myself, Morris Reese, Donnie Snow, Al Gardner, and others. The school, you know, we may not be able to save the kids that this generation that's already of age, but we're looking at this next generation. And so I'm not just the police chief, I'm a concerned citizen who understands that what we do today will have an impact on what this community looks like tomorrow. So I'm not a type of person who pontificates and complains about everything but does nothing. So yes, education is a big part of it. We know that. The question is, what are we doing to impact education? Let me give somebody else a chance, Maria, and then I can come back to you. It's Mr. Turner.
As a parent of a child that goes to RCLA, I want to thank you for starting that school up, first and foremost, because I think that, like you just made the comment, that it starts with the educational piece as well. My son was going to another public school here, and making the change, you can tell the difference you can tell the difference when teachers care. And I've been to the school, Al's there working, and it creates an environment that they want to be a part of, and that will lead to them having better lifestyles as they grow. And as a member of an organization that's trying to get into teaching or to counsel youth in the community, I want to say that without that piece, our kids, after they get out of grade school, will be totally out of hand, because they'll form their cliques. Those cliques will form into gangs. Those gangs will start robbing, breaking into businesses and things like that. But I do want to say thank you for starting that up, because I have seen a difference.
Appreciate that, Mr. Turner. Really quickly, for those who don't know, Racine Civil Leaders Academy, this is a project-based learning school. So kids who may not have done well in the traditional setting, you know, this project-based learning, they can do things with hands-on exercises. And again, this is just the first year, so we're not claiming victory, but we're doing some unique things there. Mr. Gardner actually works with the young people, and he kind of helps them through some of their conflicts. And so he would probably tell you a lot of horror stories about dealing with young people. But the thing is we're dealing with them while we can still shape their minds. Somebody's got to do it. And so that's why I admire people who are on the front lines. It's okay to complain, but we just have to take that energy and, you know, push it into something positive. Yes, sir.
I just want to add that, as the lady said, you know, you have these families that are, you know, single parent families and things like that. The projects that you incorporated in RCLA help kind of give them that feeling of a family organization. You know, like my son comes home every day, you know, to brag about all of the accomplishments that he has made in school. And I'm telling you, I just can't say it enough. It makes a big difference when somebody cares about them. You know?
That's good. That's good for us to hear, because we, as board members, we fight about the politics of it all. But it's good to hear what actually the outcomes are, because that's what's going to make a difference. Did anybody in the back not get a chance? Yes, ma'am.
Could you tell us, our prisons in Wisconsin, are they privately run or are they state run? Or which ones are which?
There's a little bit of all of it, but just for the benefit of the people who may not know what you're sharing, essentially is there's an unfortunate reality nationwide that prisons is business. There's people make money off of prisons, and so yeah, that's an issue, and you know, so this is debated, but the first part that I'm going to tell you is not debated. The second part is debated. I work with a local group of leaders here to deal with, it's called Schools of Hope through United Way, and then we have a couple leadership councils. And what I learned, it was fascinating to me when I learned this. I learned that and this will make sense when you hear it, from first grade to third grade, kids are learning to read. They're literally learning to read. From third grade and beyond, you're reading to learn. So, and we have an educator, Miss Hicks is in the back, so she would know this. So when you get all those math problems that I used to hate, Johnny has 27 apples and 15 of lemons and 32 of something else, and if you did this and that and the other, at the end of the day, what would you have? I don't know, because there's too much reading. So, if it's true that from first grade to third grade you learn to read, and from third grade beyond you're reading to learn, if you're not proficient by the time you get to third grade, you're behind and you'll never catch up. That's the factual part. Here's the part that's debated, but is probably true. When people look to build prisons, they look at test scores for certain age groups to know how many prisons they're going to need to invest in. That's debated. I put a disclaimer on my data, young man. But it's probably true. Whether it's third or fourth, you put the grade in there. I think most people who invest money don't want to burn their money. So they have to have something anecdotal to base their investment decisions on. I think it's probably accurate, but I'm not a scholar. I'm going to come back to you. Yes, sir, young man, yeah.
Oh, that just reminded me of fugitive slave laws, where judges and attorneys and slave catchers were incentivized to send slaves back to the South. That kind of reminds me of privatization of prison systems.
Yeah, there's a fascinating book, The New Jim Crow, that
Michelle Alexander.
And we're looking at bringing her here to Racine. Yeah, we're looking at bringing her here because the things that we're discussing are like so way much bigger than me, right? But because I have a platform, then I have to use the platform to affect change, right? So that's what we're doing. So are we out of time here, or
Two more questions.
Okay, two more. Maria, and then we'll give. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I'll come back to Maria because she had a chance, but we'll get you in before we're done. Yes, ma'am.
I missed the answer about what percentage of the prisons are private.
I don't have that data. Yeah, but I was acknowledging the larger point, which is that some of them are private, and that it's a business. That's what was being stated. Yes, sir. Mr. Thomas.
10 years ago, 2005, there was a public meeting at the YWCA. And out of that came an organization that we now call Coming Together Racine, whose mission statement is to actively challenge and eliminate racism in the greater Racine community. And there's a lot of people in this room that are part of that organization. I want to thank Jessica McPhail because she is the treasurer of that organization. Nancy here is one of the three co-chairs. We meet the second Thursday of the month at 7:30 in the morning at the United Way in the large conference room. And I guarantee you, we're not going to turn anybody away, and we can fit at least 35, 36, maybe 40 people in there. And it's an organization that's been around now. It'll be 10 years. Now, we can look back and say, what was it like in 2005? And where are we now in 2015? And that's something that we are talking about. And when we talk about systemic racism, we know that there's still challenges in this community. And I also remember when our chief, and I think this is one of the best things that could have happened in Racine, the politics, and I'll call it ugly politics, that surrounded him become a chief. I think this community still has a lot of things to do, but we've got a lot of positive that's going on right now, and it's only going to get better.
Appreciate it.
Let me just say one thing. I just want to ask one thing. We had a situation where it was a 12-year-old boy that stabbed one of the students from the school.
Right.
Can you tell me, okay, he was waived into adult court, is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, because of the nature of the injuries. Yes.
Because of the nature of the injuries.
Right. We also just.
So was it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part. I didn't hear the second.
Did this individual have to go to the hospital? They went to the hospital, but did they have to stay at the hospital any length of time?
I don't know all the facts relative to that, but I know the injuries were, it was considered egregious. I just want to share with you really quickly, you may recall The only other time I remember something like that happening, whereas we had a homicide, Darnell Williford, from the top of the King Center, where we had an 11-year-old. And so every now and then in society, some really egregious thing happens, and the rules look like they're different. I can't speak to the charging part of it, and because the DA decides what that would look like, and so that's probably better directed to that person. But I do know the attack could have been actually a life-threatening situation, and so, but if...
Yeah, I understand it could have been, but it wasn't, and yet it was still charged as if it was, and so I guess that's kind of disturbing that...
Well, again, I mean, that's a question I think that you can direct that directly to the district attorney, because they, again, as I shared earlier, they decide what charge they could actually successfully prosecute. And so that's a prosecutor's question, but we did have a similar situation with the 11-year-old.
Comes out here like you have, and police officers.
Yeah.
I can look at the officer.
I will invite them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I will invite them. Yeah. So really quickly, and just in the wrap-up time, I see some people here that are, I want to close with a couple different things. Maria, let me let you. Sure, we'll get one quick question in for Maria, and then we'll close out.
I'm just wondering what you've done, what you're doing, and what you're going to be doing to gain the trust of the Hispanic population, because there's so many unreported crimes, and they're afraid to go to the police.
Yeah, so we hear that a lot, right? So what I've done, what I'm doing, what I'm going to do. So let's start with what I've done. So first thing I did when I became chief is I met with local pastor, John Freddy Correa. So we've met several occasions, and I've met with local Hispanic business owners to talk about the very thing you said. Now, I wouldn't doubt that there are still Hispanic people who are afraid to report things because of their status. I wouldn't doubt that at all. But as I shared with Diana, you can come to the police department and you too can look at the U visas that I've signed. And you can compare how many were signed with every other administration before now. And so what I've done, before I signed all those U visas, I met with Pastor John Freddy Correa. We went to the church, Emmaus, and then it was a much larger crowd than this. So I took a lot of questions and a lot of frustration from years, right? Like I'm the new sheriff in town, so to speak, and then they're gonna let me hear their frustrations, which was appropriate because I can take it, because I don't take it personally. So at the end of about a 2-hour session, much like this one, a lady finally comes up to me and she says, well, we really weren't talking about you. We're talking about the guys in the brown shirts. They were talking about the sheriff's department the whole time. But back to your question, what did I do? Well, I could have left in and said, well, you weren't talking about me, so I'm going to just leave. But no, I went to talk to the sheriff. And Diana knows this because she was there. And then I got the sheriff to do what Al was asking me to do for the district attorney. I brought the sheriff back with me the next time I went. So you can ask him, because he's right there. That's part of what I did. The other part of what I did is I called the Department of Homeland Security, and I had a specialist come in to explain to me exactly what is this U visa thing and why should I, when should I sign these? Under what circumstances? So I have a 3-ring binder amongst hundreds of other binders that tells me when and where I should sign those.
All right, let's get off the U visa thing. Let's talk about the in general. How Hispanics, not just being a woman.
Yeah. Well, which is it? Are people not? No. But when you say people are afraid to report things,
It's usual.
that's why they get the U visa, so that they cannot be afraid.
There's other kinds of crimes. Breaking into their home, breaking into their stores, getting beat up, getting robbed.
Yeah, but you asked a specific question, which was threefold. You said, "What have I done? What am I doing? And what am I gonna do?"
Get out the U visa.
But that's one of the things that I did. If you don't want to hear about that, then okay, we're done answering your question. Then you don't want to listen to. You don't want to hear my answers because they're not what you want to hear. That's okay, ma'am. Do you have a question? I explained it earlier, but U visa is temporary. You can have even if you're not documented, if you're a victim of a crime and you've cooperated with law enforcement, lot of people don't like the word amnesty, but it's basically you're not going to be deported just because you reported that crime. You can actually get temporary status to stay based on your cooperation with law enforcement. So really quickly, so I'm going to end on a positive note. Challenging questions, I can take it all day long, but you know, it has to be respectful and it has to be based on facts and not just emotion. So I can exchange with anybody in here any day of the week as long as we keep it respectful and we try to bring facts to the table. And we acknowledge we're not always where we want to be, but we're not where we used to be. And that's what you got to remember. A couple giants in the room, people I look up to. Chuck Tyler, just we tip your hat there. Mr. Tyler and I, he's given me some grace here, but for about 10 years, Chuck has been working on an unbelievable manuscript. So Chuck comes to me a few years back. He, much like Polzine identified me as a computer guy, Chuck's doing this phenomenal book on what was going on in the 60s where they marched to get community centers and all this kind of stuff. And so the archives that this man has is just unbelievable. The news clippings, so he put it into a manifesto, so to speak, but he had it all cut in clippings like that in a scrapbook. And I said, Chuck, we can't upload that to the internet. So we had to convert it all, and we're literally in the last weeks of doing that. Just a phenomenal story about his journey from, you know, the South to being the first department head of color for the city, the Park and Recs department. He has a passion for youth. The manuscript is called Youth in the Center of My Heart.
May I have your attention, please? The library will close in 20 minutes. Have any materials to check out? Please do so now.
So just one of the guys that I look up to amongst people like Thelma Orr, Miss Corrine Owens, this man we still have with us now. He's a gem. We gotta cherish him as long as we have him. We sit and have coffee often. The reason that I can stand before you and have some semblance of, you know, reason is because I have people like that in my life that I go to. And you know, and so thanks for being here, Chuck. Barney Nellis, another good friend of mine. So Barney, I'm talking to Barney one day. We used to go out for lunch every now and then. I'm a lot busier now, so I owe you lunch, Barney. So Barney's telling me about how he was at the March on Washington, and I'm just astonished at all the stories that these folks have in their heads. It's just fascinating. Sister Jean Verber, I'm gonna have to ask her to stand up. I'm gonna have to ask you. Yeah, just stand up, just for me, real quick. And I can do this all night, you know. We're doing some human trafficking, you know. The Sienna Center, they're giants in the community in terms of, you know, social justice and a lot of other stuff. As Mr. Thomas talked about, some of you may have read a little bit of controversy with the whole chief's appointment thing. I don't talk about it a lot because, quite frankly, you know, my position was, hey, if that was what God had for me, that they weren't going to be able to take it away, and apparently that's what God had for me. So, but Jean Verber, she wrote the most scathing letter about this Chiefs thing that I had ever seen in my life. I was like, this didn't come from a sister, did it? Maybe a sister, but not a sister. The people in this community of many different shades came together for a common purpose. That's what makes this community different. Thank you.